The traveller first noticed the cheek scar at a tea shop in the market square. A man spread a wide sheet of paper across his table and then drew upon it and made notations in its margins. After several days, the traveller approached and saw the sheet held a map. He asked, and they talked about the hills and the southerly wind that blew with hardly a pause, day after day, night after night. They talked about walking, and the traveller could tell the man knew the surroundings as well as anyone could. "I will show you a walk," the man said. "It runs down the river, and then north over the hills. We can then circle around to meet the river again, to follow it back into town." The man suggested the traveller go with him that very day, and the traveller agreed. They stopped at the man's house, an old mill of stone walls and wooden beams set against a steep section of hillside. The mill wheel creaked with the movement of water in the race, and the scent of early morning bread lingered in the air. "I am a baker," the man said. "The ovens are downstairs, but the fireplace there shares the chimney with the bread ovens. I also mature cheese in caves in the hillside out back. Between them I make my living." Books stood on shelves. A thick rug of ornate pattern shifted and resonated over the floor. The traveller recognized silk work of the eastern mountain people, far away across sea and land. On the rug and nearer the fire, pillows lay and books were piled here and there. One chair stood by the fire. All of the furniture was made of hardwood and joined with skill. It was sturdy, well-worn and simple. A solid, wide wooden ladder led to an upstairs room. From the window the mill pond was still. Familiar willows dipped finger leaves at the water's surface. The man collected a cloak and walking stick. His trousers and shirt were of loose cloth that was easy to move in. He wore no shoes to protect his feet from the roughness of the ground or from the cold stone floor. The man threw the cloak over his shoulder and they departed through the door they had entered. "I noticed your scar," the traveller said. "Must have been quite a wound. How did you come by it, if you don't mind my asking?" "Well, it is difficult to miss, but it wasn't as bad as it appears, and the one who gave it to me bore the most part of the wound. What I got was just enough to remember someone by. It was in payment for a debt someone thought I owed. He wished for more, but this was all he got. He was a thief. I owed him nothing." "It was over a woman," said the traveller, not asking. "Of course. What else brings men to passion?" They walked beside the river in the direction of the guild town, far ahead to the east where the river widened and then branched like a tree. There, though, there was no sign of that town, only the steady flow of water and footsteps almost silent in the grass. The man's awareness of his path was highly tuned. His feet, tough but careful, moved no slower than they would if clothed in leather. They navigated stones and roots with precision. No two strides were of the same length, and yet each was smooth and regular. His eyes never seemed to linger on the ground. Instead, he looked to the river, to the trees and sky, and to the traveller. "Yes, it was a woman. She was his wife, and I took her from him. He never forgave it, never understood it. What can I say? That is what I did, and it was not the only time." "And the woman?" "She was gone by the time I received this." The man ran his finger over the scar. "He took her life, not directly. I mean, he killed her, but in such a way as can never be punished except in a man's soul. That is what I meant when I spoke of a debt to him. I never owed it. He was the one that owed a debt. He could never accept it, though, and so looked to me to indemnify his guilt. But I refused, so he gave me this. That was his nature. I was not like those he normally victimized." The man glanced at the traveller as if expecting, but then answered the question he expected. "Oh yes, I knew about him. He was a bastard. It showed in all his dealings. Not that I dealt with him, I didn't, but I heard enough to make my own picture, a sufficient picture. You saw my home, and I know enough to know a travelled man. I've seen more of life than that man will ever know. He didn't scare me. I've seen men far more vicious. That doesn't let him off the hook. I'm just saying I've known worse. I don't respond well to attacks on my person, and I did not take kindly to it then. The satisfaction of this cut was all he received from me. He never saw me again, but I am a fair man. I could see his weakness." "What do you mean?" the traveller asked. "I have come across two schools in my life. One says you can never blame a man for his faults, that he acts in the best way he can. The other says man chooses his course and is responsible for his choices. Frankly, I believe in both. They are not incompatible. He was responsible, and for that reason I took his wife. But he was not responsible, and for that reason I received the wound he gave, and I didn't kill him for giving it. Perhaps I should have done. Goodness only knows the damage he has done in his life. But no, I recognize that he should know his pain and should live it. Indeed, he should live long enough to know what his wife knew, the pain that he killed her with, the pain that I knew upon her death, the pain of the injustice that allowed it to be the case that ever since I've borne this scar upon my face. Anyway, like I said, I refused to take any more than this. He got no payment from me, quite the contrary. The traveller responded, "But you took his wife. You did not consider that you owed him compensation? Do you think it can be taken for granted that I owed him compensation? I could say that most men would say you did. If he had killed you, would he not have been forgiven?" "Very likely. Actually, it is true, but I never accepted those terms. I never submitted myself to that authority, certainly not to his authority, and therefore, to the extent they were the same, neither to that of others." "You said this was not the only time." "No, it wasn't." "And you were comfortable with the pain you caused? You said you did not accept the pain of the woman's husband, the debt he felt you owed him, and that most would have held you to owe him. What about that? Should he not have sought repayment from you?" "No, he should have, if he felt he owed it. Man should always seek what he thinks he is owed. But he should fight for it. It won't always be given easily." "So you don't hold it against him that he sought payment?" "Of course not. Why should I? Anyone can believe whatever he wants. He can feel he is owed all sorts of things, but nothing comes that is not already owned. So if one fights for something, it is out of another's hands that one must pry it. He thought that I owed him. I did not feel I did, so I fought it, and in the end he got what he deserved and I got what I deserved. We get what we win, but we only win what we are able to win, and if we do not win it, then we do not deserve to have it." "So you, when you met that husband, you said you took her from her husband. Did you have to fight for her?" "Not really. A little bit perhaps, but not really. Why do you think I said I owed her husband nothing? There was no value I got that I took from him. He did not own what I took. So yes, in name I took her, in terms of a certain kind I took her, but according to the terms that mean anything to me, I didn't actually take her, she was already mine. Or more precisely, she belonged to something else altogether, and I was merely the agent of that which took back its own." "What do you mean you were the agent of what owned her?" "I mean she was good, a good woman, caring, loving. Her husband never deserved her. You know I said a moment ago that everything wins what it is meant to win? Well, that doesn't always happen straight away. In a sense it does. We must be where we must be. But at the same time, well, I suppose the easiest way to put it is that she was on loan. That's not very clear, and I don't really know what I mean by that. No, that's wrong. Of course I do. She must have needed to be with her husband for some reason, or she wouldn't have been with him. But by the time I met her, she had served her time. I saw that, and I released her." "You took it upon yourself to make a judgment of that kind? Is that not bold?" "Perhaps, but like I said, I don't care for those terms. They don't mean anything to me. Her husband's friends would have thought it in those terms, if he had any. But I don't think that way. No, boldness in fact had nothing to do with it. I merely did what was obvious to do. I was to take her. I saw her. Our eyes met, and I knew I was to take her. It was as simple as that. Other considerations didn't come into it. Again, I had no contract with her husband. She was the one who tied herself to him. Why should I respect that choice? In fact, don't even answer that question. I will answer it. There is no reason I should. There is only one thing I respect, and that is truth as I know it. And what I saw of truth that day told me she had served her time, and I stood there holding the key to her cage in my hand, and I could either leave her there imprisoned, or I could release her and she could try her luck as a free woman. Regardless of whether I was right or wrong, that is what I did. And I never regretted it, because when I once came close to doing so, I asked her and she called me a fool, and that was that. But do you know why I knew not to regret it? Because the contract she signed locked her in a cage. She was emaciated, hungry, tired. I freed her from a cage. He called it a marriage and thought I stole her. I didn't steal her. Only someone like him can steal. I didn't take her from one cage only to put her in another. I fed her, I gave her food, fresh air, and let her be her own. So if that seems bold, perhaps it is. It may seem too bold to take such power of judgment upon oneself and affect lives so, but what do I care? I act for myself. But do you see the difference? Her husband acted for himself, and I acted for myself, but look at the result. What was it? Do you even know the result? The traveler asked. I know her result. That was all that mattered to me. What was her result? She was free, which was more than could be said prior to my meeting her. She didn't even live long after that, but what does that matter? She knew it didn't matter. She knew freedom. That is what mattered to her. She had served her time, paid whatever debt she owed that forced her into that situation to begin with. God knows what it was. I certainly don't and probably never will. But that too doesn't matter. So to answer your question, no, I don't know the result. I don't know what placed her there. I don't know why she was there. I don't know all the repercussions of my actions. All I know is that when I looked into her eyes, I saw her bound, a beautiful person enchained, and I heard a voice within me saying, pursue her, free her. She is the one you want, take her. And that is what I did, and like I said, when I questioned my choice, she laughed at me. Might she have laughed at the irony that you would take her and then only question your action after the fact? No, that is not why she laughed. I have told you the complete story. She laughed because it was the best thing that had ever happened to her, or so she said, and so she believed, if my judgment was anything to go by. And you might ask if my judgment might be biased in the circumstance, and I asked myself that question. But I knew that she regretted all that had come before. She realized she could change nothing. I don't mean to say she regretted it completely. That would be careless, and she was not a stupid woman. She regretted that for whatever reason her life had to be what it was. She too didn't know why she had to marry her husband over another man, why he should have turned out to be the type of man he was. She even regretted her sons, though she loved them. The traveler watched the man carefully. She regretted what she knew would come of them, the part she had played in bringing into the world boys who had become like their father. She realized there was nothing she could do about it. She loved them and gave them as much as she could, but she knew it was not enough, and it was not just that she was up against her husband, she was up against the entire world that he was immersed in, and it was killing her. I'm not saying she didn't question her decision. Why do you think I said that I didn't really take her? I didn't really win her. It was her choice to come. I gave her the choice. That was the difference between myself and her husband. I gave her the choice. I unlocked the door, held it open. I said to her, if you're ready, I'm here to open the door. If you're ready to leave, you may do so now. Just consider it. She considered it, and her children were an important part of that decision, but she was already dying. She knew it. I could see it. She had to act. That is what I had seen in her eyes. Her children were only young, but she could see that she had given them all she could give them, and she had given her husband all she could give him. Her time was up. She had reached a point where there would be no happiness after that if she chose to stay. But she herself could still know a little joy if she chose to leave. So you see, she chose herself over her husband and children, just as I chose myself over her and over her husband and children. We each chose ourselves. That is what we recognized in each other in that moment when we met. We realized that nothing mattered but the truth we saw in each other, and that all else would fall as it must. It sounds awful, doesn't it? Do you think I don't see that? Of course I do, but that's a strange thing. It sounds awful, and yet it wasn't. She gained her happiness. Do you know what she realized? This is what she said to me, more or less her words. I loved my children more than anything, and I know I was all the love they have, but I believe by leaving I saved them. If I had not left, they would have watched me die, the only source of love in the world they knew, crumbling and dying. Now at least I can hope that they will remember my love when it was still strong. That is what she said, and frankly I think she may very well have been right to feel that way. Again, I will never know, but to see the joy return to her eyes, the color of the sun in her cheeks, that was enough for me. I never again questioned what I had done, and I always held to that because I had not sought what her husband had sought. My own actions were blameless. I acted for myself, but in acting for myself I sought truth and goodness. And yes, it caused pain, and I have the scar to prove it, but ultimately she lived again, and she thanked me. The man fell silent. He had been directing the way they had walked as they turned from the stream of the river that ran through Riverton to follow a small beck up a valley to the north. They climbed alongside the stream, crisscrossing it by grey rocks covered with lichen, and stepped silently along banks that were soft with moss and interspersed with clumps of moorgrass that waved long quills from the ground. The man moved easily, occasionally stepping into the cold water with his bare feet and walking a few steps before emerging at the other bank, only to cross again as though all that really mattered was the opportunity to step into the water. There were times when he would stop and listen for a moment before continuing, and the traveler merely matched the pace, followed the man's steps and his story. "This is why I really come out here," the man said as he crouched on a stone and dipped his hand in the water. "Look around. Everything here is wet. The moss, the grass. Look at the grass here." It was under a layer of still water and was of the richest green. The soil and grass were saturated but without rot, crisp green blades within the cold freshness of the water. "This is why I don't wear shoes. I gave it up. I got used to the paths, and where I like to walk in these high valleys there's too much water for shoes. I like the water on my feet." Interestingly, these valleys on the northern side of the river get more water than those to the south. You saw me making a map. I chart springs, for no real reason. I don't ever mark the map while I'm out here. I used to bring it at first, but these days I don't bother. I explore these valleys one by one and then fill in any details by memory at lunch each day. This valley is not new to me. There are exactly 12 springs here, rising from the floor and walls, mostly at the head. The valley curved upwards away from the river, along the course of the beck. They were high and enclosed within the hills. Water was all around. Grasses were strung with shining beads. Moss retained it like a sponge. Streams flowed through its liquid crystal, and as a man had pointed out, where the ground flattened, pools of excess formed over the shallow grassy beds, ankle-deep, clear as air, sparkling green, rich and lush. There was nothing but rocks, moss and grass. Lower down, gnarled old trees had lined and shaded the beck, but higher, where they walked, there were none. It was just open grey stone, green grass, and clear, glistening water saturating it all. A descending cloud had started to shroud the hilltops and upper valley. Even the people of Riverton don't venture here often. Most head upstream, which is not surprising. It's in the nature of the people there to head upstream. We will circle back around to the west and then drop down from above the town to again follow the course of the river. I just happen to have a special fondness for this high valley, and it was your company that made me come this way today. Something told me you would like it here. It is a very fine walk, thank you, the traveler said. You said earlier that you were able to recognize a traveled man. I could say I noticed at your house that you are a traveled man. In another time. These walks have sufficed since I made my home in Riverton. I don't crave the journey anymore. Until I came here, I could never feel comfortable settling anywhere. Always something moved me on, the next adventure, the next experience, a change of scene. Mainly, I just never felt comfortable anywhere else. Something was always missing. As confident as I have generally been in myself, there was always something that made me uncomfortable. I needed to move. I would feel pressured, and so I would leave. It is the same here, I suppose. I still must walk, still must rise above the river valley and the town into the space of the hills, the solitude of the quiet valleys. Even this cloud now, that many would find oppressive, I love. True, it prevents a sense of distance, but within its enclosure there is a different sort of space. I am sure it's not easy to see. It requires one to look differently, but the space is there, an even greater space than exists when one can see clear to the horizon. The traveller walked and listened. Of course, those constantly moving are generally avoiding something within, and rather than admit that what needs to change is something internal, it is easier to attach the issue to something outside. In my case, leaving was always a release of pressure. So far, here, I haven't craved that change. I'm happy to return home to Riverton. It was probably changes in me that caused the current comfort. Perhaps I am less likely to cause the issues that once required I always move on. Or perhaps it is simply that I like it here and that I could just never really abide all those places I was before. But expectation of change causes movement, an attachment to energy that arises in a new environment. My need to travel always held that element within. But did you not say that you always moved to release pressure? The traveller asked. For me, the need to travel was itself a pressure. What do you mean? I mean that when I was not feeling the energy of new experience, I felt unsettled, stressed even. Is not the energy of new experience itself a form of stress? Why did you not embrace the pressure and remain? There are different stresses in life. There are some I embrace and some I don't. How do you distinguish? I choose what I want. Based on what? I have always chosen between stresses. There are some I crave and others I avoid. When I was younger, I think I created conflict to produce a stress to which I would then have to respond. I keep to myself more now. But to be fair, I did not create that conflict for no reason. It was because I couldn't be quiet or sit still. It's just who I am. I respond quickly, too easily perhaps. If there was nothing to be said against the world that I so often offended, then it would seem only capricious. But I didn't create discord for the sake of discord. I've never been that way. I'm just uninhibited. I always have been. I see things my way and have generally felt it is my duty to point out inconsistencies. I do it with myself and with others, with anything. I always carried a naive presumption that people would or should wish to know, to have the benefit of what seemed to me a pertinent perspective on something that affected them. Then how is it you chose Riverton? Surely Riverton is regimented in its ways. Has it not, like anywhere else, developed its own habits with their own inconsistencies? Riverton seems all the same, but actually it is full of people who just like to do things their way. We are all individualists here, and so we are all different. The sameness you see is deceiving. What do you mean? I mean we all take care of ourselves. The sameness is that we all pursue ourselves. In that way, there is a consistency about who we are, but in seeking to satisfy ourselves, we do not displease others. How so? Well, think about it. Riverton, you must have seen, is, in its own informal way perhaps, an incredibly controlled place, right? But did you consider where the control comes from and what it is in aid of? Have you heard of any governing entity here beyond the bells and the clock tower? You haven't, because there isn't any. What we have in common is that we all have recognized an interest in maintaining our individual boundaries. We are aware of what we are doing, and so we know how we affect others. I look after my own situation, and everyone else does the same. What I provide to the community, bread and cheese, is all I provide. I don't bother anyone here with anything else. Elsewhere there was always something to irritate. Here it is a sameness that allows me to stay. It is a self-imposed control that everyone here employs. Without that I would have had to leave, just as I did before. I got off track, but now my answer has brought us back to what I was talking about before. There are stresses I invite because they are good, and others I don't because they aren't. Those that are good are of the sort that make me stronger. For me here, the stress of converging on a position of mutual reliance is no stress, if the nature of the position itself justifies the convergence. The stresses that caused me to move on again and again were not the stresses of choices to compromise in the short term for a longer term gain. There was never any gain to be had. I felt pressured because the stress I felt was not one that helped me. No, it was the pressure of imposition, the imposition of all the unthinking behavior that I saw. Like the behavior of the man who gave me the scar, who thought nothing for his wife except in the context of his distorted view of his own intention, which was really, quite simply, to control. He didn't take care of himself, and the result was to be seen in his surroundings. Those closest suffered the most, his wife certainly, and no doubt his children too. The traveller said, "But by imposing yourself into his world, were you not yourself failing to consider the costs of your own actions to that man and his family? You described the justification, but it only holds if you take it upon yourself to act, if you are in a position to act. Without that presumption, how is your self-interest different from that man's? You also sought to control." The man responded, "There is a difference in intention and in result. Once freed of him, she faced the stress of the open world in the aftermath of her marriage. It was considerable for her. She was not made to face the rawness of what the world offers. Her parents never had that in mind when they designed her upbringing. She had to fend for herself. Well, she had help from me and from one or two others, but without it she wouldn't have survived long enough to find the happiness she did in fact find. The difference is in the consideration given to the effects of one's actions, in the valuation of those effects. It is true that I like to control the effects of others upon me, and to do this I control my own environment. I control myself, my space, where I place myself, and what I put into the world. But I also control what I take in. Everywhere I'd ever been, I found myself subject to the offensive actions of others. Such actions, when taken too far, result in the necessity for regulating bodies that apply model rules to countless circumstances. And I understand the sense in this, provided there is flexibility built in. But for those of us who prefer to govern ourselves and who are actually able and willing to do so, an alternative is preferable. The thing is, there is no guarantee that the model employed by a government will be right or sensible. It could be, but it isn't necessarily. It is what someone, who may or may not have been a wise person, thought up. Or it may be what a body of self-interested people thought up to help them reinforce their interests while hiding behind a stamp of authority. And in all of those cases, the interests may be entirely well-intentioned, and the efforts on their behalf also. That is not the point. It is not enough to be well-intentioned. Intention is only part of it. Result is what counts. Intention is merely a way to measure how a person should be judged. Intention is a subjective measure. The result is the objective measure. But they both count. Great intentions can be stifled by others or by factors in the environment. People can't be judged on their so-called achievements in the world alone. Anyway, I'm not generally impressed by people's ability to institute sensible mechanisms of control, and so just as much as I don't like the idea of exposing myself to the inconsiderate behavior of others, I also prefer not to have to rely on an external governing body to take care of me. Frankly, I would rather just live here, where I don't need to face all of that. Here, the stress I face is different. It is in the strain of muscles in climbing the hill. It is a pressure to concentrate and to always improve myself. I no longer feel that constant dragging need to escape to anonymity. You referred to the presumption in my justification. I can't say whether I was right or wrong in all those hundreds of instances where I chose conflict over acceptance. In that world out there, everybody seeks control precisely because there is no order. Even those mechanisms that purport to provide only do so with distortion. Really, they're just one more voice in the crowd. No, there's another type of order altogether. Do you see what sort of a place Riverton is? It is remarkable because its order is inherent. It doesn't need to be governed because it governs itself. The order is there because the townspeople understand that the first importance is to protect, with incredible conscious fortitude, a certain type of individuality. Not individuality of some ambiguous meaning in which any and all uniqueness is valued equally, but individuality of the type that exists in any smoothly running system, in which each part respects the other parts as contributing positively to the goal. In Riverton, this is easy because the positive contribution is actual, not merely intended. How do you achieve that? By understanding individuality as a responsibility, not just an expression. What responsibility? The responsibility of upholding individuality according to consideration and foresight, of choosing actions that strengthen the individual through engagement in honest action, in honest, useful progression. They had arrived at the river again, now upstream from Riverton, and began the journey downstream to the town. The traveller said, "You seem to be saying there is a responsibility to bear the burden of certain stresses and to avoid the burden of others." The responsibility is to the self, to the truth of the fully realized self. Anything conflicting with that must be fought. But fighting alone is tiring and discouraging. Here in Riverton I've been able to relax a little, enough to realize how tense I had been, like living through long winters where you're constantly fighting off the cold. What you describe, are these thoughts common here? Is this a recognized understanding that applies to the governance of this town? No, I wouldn't say that. We each have our own way of understanding how it is that this community works. But underlying all of those different views, again, there's a commonality. We have no need to be regulated. No reason for it has arisen. Everyone is careful. The type of disputes that would lead to the need for it do not happen here. If I lived elsewhere, I would be the same as I always was. I still wouldn't accept what I do not feel I should accept. But it will take more than me or others like me acting alone to change the flow of mankind, to change the tide of what man does. To be honest, I just got sick of it. This scar had much to do with that. It was too much. There was a cutthroat ugliness about the whole affair. I got a little too deep and it became messy. Sometimes, even if one fully believes in one's actions, results can occur that make one question those actions. I became disheartened. I had always relied on my own personal strength of character, my own resilience to pull me through. I'd been through many scrapes, and this one with that man was not the first, but it was the nastiest. I had no doubt that I'd been right in all that I did, but the wound cut deeper than this scar would suggest. Really, with hindsight, it is what caused me to give up. What do you mean, give up? I mean to find this place and move here, to leave travels behind, to forget the world out there, to not try anymore to affect the lives of people by adding my own small voice against injustice. Every time a person like me recedes in disgust, society has lost that voice. It is what it is. By being as it is, society has made a multitude of choices that arrive at a singular repercussion, the world as it is right now. If it continues as it is, then all others like me shall also leave, and society will have lost those voices and what those voices represent. It is merely a matter of the value of that voice, if that particular voice has value. Of course, society is the result of a balance of many interests, and the removal of any voice will have an effect. But where that voice offers a particular regulating mechanism, that mechanism will cease, and people like that man will be all the more able to act with free rein. There won't be anyone left who doesn't think enough to not impede them. Doesn't think enough to not impede them? Consider this. How many are there who can do so? Does it not take a particular type to question and interfere? To not just take the easier path of acceptance? Whatever it is that caused me to be the way I am, well, I can tell you for certain that not all carry that trait. And further, consider this too. In the absence of support of that trait, will it not be more difficult for that trait to develop in others? What reinforcement will they have? In this sense, I have been a failure in my life. Because you gave up? Yes, because I gave up. Because I came here. You consider living here to be giving up? In a way, of course it is. That world out there still exists. All I've done is find an island from which I can ignore it. Maintaining this town and its ways is something, of course. The town itself has its own value. But these people here, they're smart people, industrious people. Should they not be out in the world influencing others instead of holed up here minding their own business? Riverton is in a way the opposite of what I've always believed in. I always believed in being active in the world. I had seen the inside of cloisters, and for purposes of knowing for what one fights, there is much to be said for the cloistered life. But surely a person must take what he has learned and use it in the world, apply it in whatever way he can. I applied it and never standing still. These people have pulled a shade over their eyes. I think they have forgotten what lies beyond these hills. At this point, I don't think they want to know about it. So yes, I think I must have given up. The fact is, I realized I had never been able to relax. Not that I think we should relax, but I was tired of the wounds I received from my efforts. It is too much to bear forever. I don't blame these people for staying here. Most have been here for generations, and many of those have never experienced life outside. At least, not to any great extent. This is all they know, and they wouldn't survive outside. They have no experience of how different it is elsewhere, and if they were to travel and attempt to settle somewhere else, they would quickly discover that at fundamental levels their assumptions are different. Imagine talking to someone where you're speaking the same language and you look the same, but something is different about them, something is alien, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is. In my case, this is how it always was, and that difference was attractive to some, but to most it was more threatening than it would have been if I'd come from the other side of the world, because then they'd expect the difference. There's nothing scarier than thinking you know something and relying on it, only to find out it is not at all what you thought, and in fact is exposed to your fundamental insecurities. I was an alien out there. I always belonged here. I know that because I fit here, and I always would have done. But should I not be out there? The traveler replied, "Perhaps, but it seems you know that you are where it is right for you to be." "I do know that. I have always known that. But that says to me simply that I was destined to fail in that world. Not to fail in myself, for I didn't do that. But I did give up on that world in coming here and staying here. I no longer have even a small influence in the world I came from." The traveler said, "Every action has its repercussions, yours no less than those with which you struggled. I think my effect must have been minimal. I never built my position into anything more than a personal way of living. And we don't export our way from Riverton. We're cut off. That's the only way this place has survived. It doesn't try to impose itself outside. It's self-limiting in that way. Here we hide in order to survive. I have never found comfort with that. The one place that works so well that it doesn't require laws, the one place I know that must hide in order to survive. This town should be the centerpiece of the country, but it is not. Instead, it behaves more like an embarrassment, like something ashamed. What sort of society would so quickly destroy something that is so obviously good? That is the question I came to, that caused me to come here. At least here I can lose alongside others." "Do you lose?" the traveler asked. "Not ultimately. It is the world that needlessly destroys that loses. We retain integrity here in our little haven. But how can we not lose when we forget that there is more, that we are not truly detached, that all it would take would be a stroke of bad luck for everything here to be lost? That is why removal, even to maintain something perfect, can never work forever, because that connection to the outside can never be completely severed, and the nastiness of the world builds in our absence, unimpeded by the very people that live here who would act as a counterbalance if they lived outside. It will eventually arrive on our doorstep, and whoever lives here then will have forgotten how to combat it, because they will have never lived with it. They won't even recognize it for what it is, and will have no tools for dealing with it when they have to. This town will be slaughtered, eaten up by the same voracious appetite that caused man to come after me. This town is no different. It too shall know the wrath of the world that by its very nature it challenges and offends. Its own face shall be cut and scarred, made to look less beautiful, and then it will be distorted by the experience, and then overrun. I see this because it is what happened to me. I was not enough alone. I fear that this town will disappear from the world, just as I did." "Is this something you have spoken of with others here? Do others see this threat?" "No, and I may be wrong. I must hope I am wrong. But I don't think I am. I long ago gave up on trying to change what cannot be changed." As they neared the town, they heard the lunchtime bells. It had been a brisk walk, following the beck to its source in high, shallow hills, and then over and down the course of another stream back to the river. At several points they had stopped to watch gurgling water fall through the grass, or to listen to the bleating of sheep hidden in the white of the low cloud. But these had been brief interludes in the man's story. The man's progress had remained, and when his feet moved, the words came to match his pace. "My name is Michel," the man said. "It was good to share the walk with you. Will you be in town for long?" The traveller thanked him and said he would be in the town a while longer to meet a friend. With a wave, Michel left him in the square and headed off in the direction of his house. Michel bore a name that belonged to the traveller's father. He had been wrong to think he had made no effect. Without him, Kieran's sons would never have become what the old man needed. But like Kieran, he had suffered the cruelty of the old man's way. Michel would never know full peace. His actions had been justified, but the cost of his cruelty must still be paid. He had won his position in Riverton, but he was not so clear of fault as to be able to fully enjoy it. But the traveller could see that it was precisely that wound that allowed him to see what very few others would have seen, the looming destruction of Riverton. Michel's skepticism had prevented his blindness. Unlike others, he could still taste the covetous appetite of a growing world not nearly far enough away.